This lecture introduces Republican Rome following the Etruscans, a civilization on the rise that would come to dominate all of the Western world. We will look at portraiture and architecture today in this civilization that begins in the valleys centered in Rome and the Five Hills, and then spreads northward and southward, eventually conquering all of the Italian peninsula, then France, Spain, North Africa, Greece, and finally Egypt, until they would have an empire larger than even that of Alexander the Great. Now, ancient Rome is the most conspicuous ancient civilization. We still can see remnants of it throughout the modern world today, in Western Europe all the way up to Scotland and England, to Ireland, down to North Africa and the Middle East. The temples, basilicas, and roads built by the civilization are still used to this very day. A staggering thought if we were to consider how short a lifespan our own engineering marvels are going to have. Ancient Rome is the derivation that we have for modernity, considering modern law and government, languages. We have Romance languages all deriving from Latin. Then, of course, the calendar. The calendar is important because the Romans will give us months like March, where we have the god of Mars named after it because we go to war on that month. Or August, named for the first emperor Augustus. Or January, named for the Roman god Janus, who looks forward and back at the beginning of the year. And finally, they give us modern coinage, where you will find emperors or important allegories are going to be seen in profile. The Romans, however, were not artists. Instead, they are farmers and fighters, Livy will tell us, the famous Roman historian. And so they do not invent the style that we will look at today. Instead, Greece invents this particular style, this nomenclature, a way of speaking and communicating visually. Rome will propagate it. But there is one more civilization to consider that is going to be significant for the Romans. For Rome is an Etruscan city and built around an Etruscan civilization. So we find that the indigenous population, who were also excellent bronze workers and artists, are going to influence Roman art. Therefore, the Greek nomenclature, sensibility, and subject will be mixed with the Etruscan interests in psychic intensity and in their beliefs that you can connect with someone in the afterlife to give us Roman art as we know it. According to tradition, Romulus, who gives his name to Rome, founded the city on April 21st, 753 BCE. At this time, Rome was an Etruscan city. Hence, we still have the Etruscan wolf standing proudly guarding over the Capitoline Hill to this very day. Unlike ancient Greece, ancient Roman periods are not divided stylistically, but instead by the political environment at the time. For the first period is going to stretch from 753 with the founding of Rome by Romulus until 509 BCE with the death of the last Etruscan king Tarquinius Superbus. The Republic that we will look at today is when we find the first great remnants of monumental architecture and large stone sculpture surviving from ancient Rome. That lasts from 509 until 27 BCE, thus the establishment of the Roman Republic until its demise with the rise of the empire. The Roman Republic, we're told by Roman historians, begins with the overthrow of the Tarquins, a family that was ruling in the area. Now, with Tarquinius Superbus, the last Etruscan king overthrown in 509 BCE, we establish a constitutional government that will be very important for the newly created American colonies and the United States of America when they come to make their government. The republic is going to be ruled by a senate, from the Latin senectute for old men. Hence you have senior citizens or a council of elders, with 2 elected consuls holding the most power, but that could balance out one another, check one another in this 2-party system, much like we have our own system of government based on. In times of crisis, a dictator could be appointed to command the armies. And of course, the only danger, as we know, that leads Rome down the path to empire is that perhaps these dictators do not wish to give up their power. Slowly, the Romans are going to begin conquering their neighbors in the 8th century to the 6th century. Then, after conquering the Italian peninsula and the Samnites and Greeks to the south, they move to the Gauls to the west in modern-day France, down to Spain, down to North Africa where they conquer the Carthaginians, and then over to the Near East. In 211 BCE, we're told that Marcellus, the Roman general, conquers Syracuse, a Sicilian Greek city, where he will then bring back the spoils of the city's artistic patrimony. Thus, according to the Roman historian Livy, the craze for works of Greek art had begun. Now, the Romans get a taste not just for farming and fighting, but for art and its expressive and propagandistic possibilities. We find even greater exposure to Greek art will come in 146 BCE, when the Roman province is going to be made of Greece. And then in 133 BCE, the last Attalid king of Pergamon wills his kingdom to Rome. Eventually, of course, Cleopatra will rule her kingdom of Egypt to the Romans as the last Ptolemaic ruler.
As noted, the Romans were highly influenced by the Greeks, in turn filtered through the Etruscans, which is where they get the pronunciation for many of the gods that originally were Greek Olympians. So the 12 Olympians named here would turn into some of the most significant deities for the Romans. Zeus, the king of the gods, became Jupiter for the Romans. Hera became Juno. Poseidon became Neptune. Demeter, Ceres. Athena kept her original name, while Hestia became Vesta, and so on. We find that Hades, who became Pluto in the Roman tradition, is not included in the Olympians because he does not live on Mount Olympus, but instead in the underworld. Thus, the Roman Capitoline Triad, or the most powerful trio of gods that often have temples built to them, are Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Now, we need to take a moment to watch Engineering an Empire, beginning around minute 13, where we see the expansion of Roman roads and aqueducts led to their cultural superiority and domination of the Mediterranean. The roads, in fact, were a Roman invention that allowed the spread of ideas, commerce, and their military battalions throughout not only the Italian peninsula, but the rest of Europe as they spread eastward and westward. Now, patrician families fabricated these legendary traditions to justify their monopoly on power, stating that they were descendants of great demigods or goddesses, such as Venus with Augustus or Hercules in other traditions. The Roman religion, which is going to be native to the peoples that settled in the area, that is not found in ancient Greek religion, relates to these deities called Numen or Numina, whereby we have the personifications of various qualities, much like northern Native Americans, where spirits could inhabit any object, and this could include ports, harbors, water. Therefore, there was a Numen for everything. In order to ensure one's control over the world, sacrificium was necessary, or a ceremony whereby a Numen would be asked to oblige or help them, much like a votive offering. This required a sacrifice.
Rome was able to spread so quickly and maintain a presence in these areas, improving infrastructure, building quickly, using their secret weapon, which was concrete. And with this new building material, they are able to make a series of structures of various shapes based on the Roman arch. As you can see in the upper center, we have a standard barrel vault where you have an arch that is continued along an axis forming a ceiling or a roof. That is the most simplistic way in which we can use an arch to make a structure. Putting them end to end, right next to it, you have a groin vault where they come together in a T-section or T-shape, if you will. This, of course, allows a greater sophistication of interior spaces, leading to the fenestrated sequence of groin vaults where there is a clear story and windows above, until finally we have the envy of the world in the lower right-hand corner, the hemispherical dome with an oculus. Thus we find that it is an arch spun around a central axis, leaving open the section at the top to the sun for ventilation and to relieve weight. With their newfound engineering technology, the Romans spread far and wide, leaving their footprint all the way to the Middle East, all the way down to Africa and up to the UK. In each one of these new Roman towns, we needed to have temples, amphitheaters, large structures. But their temples would not look like their predecessors in the civilizations that came before them, such as the Greek or the Etruscan. Instead, Roman temples are defined by eclecticism, or taking from a variety of sources to create something new. Specifically, they take Greek and Etruscan temples and combine them. Here we have the Temple of Portunus, or the Temple of Fortuna Virilis, whereby we have a temple dedicated to the Roman god of harbors. Very important for the Roman civilization, for they actually had concrete that would set underwater, allowing them to expand harbors. And this, of course, gets goods and services around the Mediterranean much more rapidly. Not only is it better for commerce, but you can ship men and materiel, weapons, and soldiers much more quickly from one side of the world to the next. So you need the god of harbors on your side. The structure here is made primarily of tufa and travertine as far as the materials are concerned that survive. Originally, we must imagine that it would have been faced very brightly with stucco that would imitate a marble in this revetment technique that the Romans will adopt to save money and materiel. We find that they will make objects and materials look more expensive than they actually are. Tufa and travertine are very cheap sandstone materials. Now the temple is going to have one interior space or cella. However, it differs from the earlier Greek temples in that there is one approach, one set of steps, and only one set of freestanding columns at the front. This would remind one of Etruscan temples, where we have a similar bi-columnar design in the front, whereas the rest are attached and or missing, moving around to the back. While the approach is going to be derived from the Etruscans, the interior space of having one cella for one cult statue is distinctly Greek. However, they also are going to depart from the Greek model as well. For we find this is not a peripteral temple as in the Greeks, such as the Parthenon and their understanding, which has freestanding columns on all four sides, as you see here in the plan on the left. Instead, Romans are going to use pseudo-peripteral models, or temples, whereby the columns are going to not be freestanding all the way around, and only generally at the front of the structure do we see them as such. So you can see that in ancient Greece, we are meant to walk around the structure. Sculpture is going to be located on both pediments, all the way around in the metopes, the triglyphs, the Ionic friezes. This is going to be a sculptural ensemble. Instead, here in this Ionic column in order for the Temple of Portunus, we have a structure that is designed to be on the front of it. It is not designed to pull you around the back of the structure. Therefore, this is unique uniquely Roman in approach, bringing together the designs of the two civilizations that most influenced the Romans in their religion and in their architecture. Another temple, which is going to be entirely unknown to the Etruscans, thus the Romans would have modeled it on Greek precedents, is going to be the Tholos temple, or a circular temple from the Greek word. So Tholos temples are almost exclusively reserved for goddesses in ancient Rome. This one is dedicated to Vesta, otherwise known as the Greek goddess Hestia. The circular temples and shape here go back to ancient Greece. As we discussed, Aphrodite of Knidos would have originally been located in one of these circular temples, allowing one to see her in the round. These also were dedicated and associated with goddesses. The circular plan, in this case for the goddess of hearth and home, who was very central and important to Roman religion, is going to, even though it is circular and even though it has freestanding columns that are going to spiral around it, it still only has one directionality, one way to approach it.
Hestia in ancient Greece, or Vesta for the Romans, literally translates hearth, and she is a very important goddess for the Romans indeed. As the goddess of hearth and home, and the right ordering of domesticity and family, she is born into the first Olympian generation, and was one of the original 12 Olympians, being replaced only by Dionysus later. She is the eldest child of Kronos and Rhea, and thus is going to be very significant. She's always shown as virginal and discussed as such. Therefore, she never leaves Olympus and is at the center of the divine household, just as she would be understood as the center to the divine family in Rome. This is defining the internal space of the female world, where she is the warmth, she is the fireplace. Therefore, the fire is how she is represented. In Rome, we find that Vesta's shrine is tended by 6 virgins. They must commit themselves to 30 years of service and can marry thereafter. However, they are not allowed to engage in any type of sexual activity in the meantime, for their purity allows them to continually fan the flames of this eternal fire, an undying flame. They're responsible for the health of the Roman family, and Rome sees itself as a big family.
The travertine Corinthian columns are also going to be modeled in Greek precedents with garlands that are going to be held up by oxen heads or on Greek models. Hence, what you do at a temple is sacrifice, generally hogs or bulls, to the gods and then burn them out front in this feast. So we find that the bulls are the sacrifice, the garlands with fruit and flowers are the promise of fertility and new life, for which the gods will give us favor. As mentioned, we still only approach the cella by one direction. The steps only go to one part of the structure. There are not steps all the way around. And you can see here at the Temple of Vesta, what has survived is the undertrappings, if you will, the concrete itself, showing us how it was actually assembled, how it was built. So the cella wall, importantly, is not made of stone, as you see here, but commenta, if you will, these tiny stones or aggregate that are held together by concrete, or a lime mortar volcanic sand and water mix. So we find that this new material of concrete allows the Romans to build incredibly quickly and cheaply. You can have an army of slaves, and these were primarily built by slave labor, carrying bags of concrete and or barrels up hills, up any terrain, mixing it on the spot and pouring it into any shape that you can imagine. This allowed for very cheap, durable structures. They realized that this volcanic sand called pozzolana, and there are lots of volcanic areas in Italy and the peninsula, they realized that when mixed, the sand would dry and set very, very concretely and much more securely than earlier versions of concrete. It will even dry underwater, they found.
The possibilities of concrete are further realized in Fortuna Primigenia, or the goddess of good fortune. Here we have with her sanctuary several terraces leading up this hillside to a Tholos temple. Again, Tholos or circular temples are associated with goddesses. Here we find a restored version of the sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia, in which we see knowledge of earlier Hellenistic art must have been well known to these architects, because we have these stair-stepping terraces that lead up to this platform, where we have a Tholos temple at the back. This is going to be very much like the stacked hypaethral temples and examples from Pergamon, such as the altar of Zeus. Thus, in 133 BCE, knowledge of the East would have been extended as this empire was bequeathed to Rome as it extended eastward. Here we have the concrete barrel vault supporting as a series of stacked structures, much like a honeycomb, each section of this artificial mountain, supporting these terraces, just as they would later for the Colosseum. This transforms the entire hillside, as this subject is now going to be made of nature according to human will and rational order. So instead of taking natural environments such as hills in the ancient Greek architectural tradition, the Romans make their own mountains of concrete.
Turning to Republican portraiture, we have a different tradition that exists in Rome than that of Greece. Here you have a patrician carrying portrait busts of two ancestors, otherwise known as the Barberini Togatus. Now, in these life-size sculptures, we have the portrait of an aristocratic man, right? Or a patrician, an upper-class man, holding portrait busts of his male ancestors. So we find that patrons from distinguished families with a proud lineage and a proud name, say like Julius Caesar, would keep these imagenes, these likenesses of their ancestors, in cupboards in their homes. They were used by patricians to point to and highlight their elevated position, to celebrate their position in society, but also as a direct conduit to their dead relatives, to pray to talk to for advice, to influence events here in the present. This tradition began in ancient Rome very simply by making actual wax death masks, that at the funeral they would pour molten wax over the deceased face and then peel it off. This is a very simple, low-tech way to retain an image, a likeness of one's dead relative. These transition to more permanent sculptures carved of marble as the centuries wear on in the Republican era. And how they will show these men, not women importantly, is going to be quite significant, for they value age, they value experience, and these things attach to Republican senatorial characters. Now, to differentiate the Greeks and the Romans, we should note that all of the herms or portrait busts we've looked at in this class thus far have been Roman copies. The Greeks would have been horrified at the idea of having someone's head represent them. That would have been a disembodied head to them. For the Greeks, portraits are always full length. They always include all the way from head to toe. So we find that the Romans, however, can abstract, can separate their understanding of a person from, once again, their entire body. They can be represented by their face alone. Now, the ancient Greeks preferred, by and large, idealized portraiture that would remove any flaws, signs of aging, and/or imperfections. Thus, they wanted the measure of everything to be that of man, the cosmos, and everything mapped out in the universe as a perfect man. For the Romans, they value age because only elders hold power. They will appreciate and commission veristic portraits that records advanced age and even exaggerates the blunt characteristics of aging. So veristic, of course, means truthful, that we have here a truthful portrait of an old man. Turning to Pericles and his idealized portraits we looked at from the High Classical era, we should note that even though he's shown as a mature man with a beard, there is not a wrinkle on his face. We do not have any crow's feet. There is not a nasolabial fold on his cheek. We do not have wrinkles around his brow. He is perfectly smooth like a god. On the other hand, we're exaggerating the effects of aging with the portrait head of an elder here, where we find these deeply incised grooves and wrinkles in the forehead. We find that the eyes are inset with bags under them. We find that the cheeks now are going to sag as jowls are going to fall off of the side of the face. All of these emphasizing the effects of aging, not hiding them. So here we have the portrait head of a man or an elder from Scopito, and this one also shows the same effects, these exaggerated effects where the skin will sag and droop, where we find we'll deeply incise and cut these incisions to suggest the effects of aging because of what it represents. It represents for them someone who has lived that long, who is serious, experienced, determined, and loyal to the Roman Republic. These were the virtues that were so admired at the time, so you show that you and your family have them. You have a right to be in control and in power. Now, the Romans believed the head alone constituted a portrait, or could constitute a portrait. The Greeks always, as in the example here of Demosthenes, always believe it should be full length. So, with this disjuncture between the body and the head, we find some very interesting combinations in ancient Roman portraiture. Oftentimes, we would see veristic heads, obviously because they appreciated what it represented with the age, but placing them on incongruous bodies that are much more youthful and perfect and idealized. In this instance, we have the portrait of a Roman general, obviously over life size at 6 feet 2 inches tall. We would have had a massive man at the time at that height. We know that it is supported by a cuirass at the base in the bottom right here, which is going to be the chest plate or the armor that Roman generals wear into battle. So we know and identify him as a soldier, as a general. The body, in turn, is modeled after those Greek athletes that were so admired and copied ad nauseum by Roman portrait artists and their patrons. So we find here that we are referencing the ideal human form and potential, but still retaining that interest in experience and age. That, of course, comes with power. So the patrician cultural superiority is here combined with that veristic portrait and this heroic status that these families had shown through the body. Obviously, his body would not have looked like this as a middle-aged soldier. It is important to remember that only freemen could possess family portraits. Slaves, under Roman law, were in fact property. However, when they were freed, very commonly slaves would commemorate the new status and this event by commissioning portraits, because they are now Roman citizens when they are freed and can own property, including buying other slaves themselves. We need to remember that slavery was considered a social necessity in ancient Rome and was practiced all over the ancient world. This is not something unique to the Romans. They, however, did have an institution built around it, and there were many more slaves in the Roman Republic than elsewhere. So by the end of the Republic, when a census was taken of the city of Rome itself, they found that there are 2 million slaves, or 1 for every 3 citizens in the city itself. This allowed the extravagant lifestyles that we read about in ancient Rome, these lavish parties, these, once again, these decadent gatherings, and once again, these symposia are only possible. Leisure is only possible when you have someone to do all of the housework, all of these domestic duties for you. Now, very often when slaves are freed, they're going to become slave owners themselves, and very often take the name of their original slave owner themselves as well. Here we have a funerary relief with portraits of the Gessi. They are going to be on either side of their master who freed them at his death. And this was considered common, that at your death you are expected to free the slaves in your employ. So here we're going to have these former slaves taking their patron's name, which is the same as what we see in 1865 in the American South, and why we have so many African Americans named Jackson, Johnson, etc. These were the owners of the slaves. So here we have Publius Gessius in the center, who was the owner, shown very elderly here because he's dead. Off to the side we have the wife, Gessia Fausta, and her husband, Gessius Primus. Well, note that women take the name of their husband and or the husband's family name. Hence, the last name of Publius Gessius is going to turn into her first name, Gessia, and it turns into the masculinized Gessius for her husband. What is interesting to note here is that Gessia, the wife, is the only one living when this is commissioned in 30 BCE. However, she is shown side by side with the dead. Hence, in the Roman religion, death does not break the bonds of a relationship. You can still talk to, converse with, and engage with your loved ones in the next life. Unlike the Greeks, for the Greeks, of course, believed that when you are dead, you are separated, you are severed from this life. You become invisible, like the invisible one Hades himself. Now, funerary processions are also going to reveal this belief, for here we have these floating registers or planes on top of which figures are standing as they're carrying the deceased, propping himself up here on his elbow to his funeral pyre. As women wail behind with children, men blow trumpets ahead and play, once again, flutes. This is going to be a procession where legibility is paramount. We would not be able to see all of these people if they were overlapping one another, but in order to make them visible, we put them on these floating ground planes so we can see them in the back, where the women in the upper left-hand corner cry and wail, and the men in the front playing two different types of instruments are going to be seen on top of one another. Now, the deceased reclining on this sarcophagus that we have up here, this funeral pyre, is going to remind us, importantly, of the Etruscan religion, where one did not die, but continued actively gesticulating and engaging with others in death. So we find that for the Romans, death is not the end, but is just a transition. This, of course, allows us to still contact them and be influenced by them in the next life. The floating ground plane, importantly, is also going to be taken from early Greek art, and so this plebeian approach to art will resurface at the end of the Roman Empire, so we'll return to this at the very end. Finally, turning to coinage and numismatic portraits, we have here the denarius with the portrait of Julius Caesar. The denarius is going to be a unit of measure for a Roman coin, the most common variety, in fact. Here we find that Julius Caesar is bold enough to replace portraits of gods that were the convention on coins with his own visage, with his own effigy. He is shown in the Republican tradition, in this veristic tradition, with an aging face, a receding hairline, all of those elements that would have a respected senator and would relate to them and their characteristics. This is coined shortly before his assassination, when he's going to acquire the title of Dictator Perpetuo, or Dictator for Life. Hence, he was seen as a threat to republican democracy and virtues in ancient republican Rome, so he was assassinated by Brutus, among other conspirators. The Romans would place images of the dead, say past rulers, consuls, or important figures like Romulus on coins, but never living people. Therefore, this violates republican propriety. It is inappropriate to do. And so we find this is going to foretell what Roman emperors will do to mold public opinion. They will put their faces on coins and spread it throughout the empire, often with deeds or allegories on the back, showing us how we should understand them and interpret them. Now in March 44 BCE, we have the Ides of March. That's followed by a civil war where Julius Caesar will be assassinated. And this leads us from the old Roman Republic to the rise of the new Roman Empire, with the grandnephew of Caesar taking over as the first emperor. Next time, we will look at life in ancient Rome with the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum and the excellent preservation there of art and architecture.